观众朋友好，欢迎收看最新一期的子天访谈录 SD Talk Show， 我是子天 Schedule。本期嘉宾为方大为 David Firestein， 乔治布什美中关系基金会总裁和首席执行官，著名中国通外交官学者，德州大学奥斯汀分校美中政策研究中心执行主任。他是3本关于中国的书籍的作者或合著者，他是一位国语最接近母语的美国人。他为许多美国和中国官员进行解释，他也是俄语的高级演讲者。在他的整个职业生涯中，大为在推进美国中国关系以及美中和美亚贸易方面发挥了积极的作用。David Firestein, the President and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for USChina Relations. Firestein speaks near native level Chinese and fluent Russian and has interpreted for senior U.S. officials in both languages. Welcome our guest, David Firestein.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
请用中文给我们的美南新闻的观众朋友打个招呼，谢谢。
大家好，很高兴有机会参加今天的这个讨论。
Okay, let us discuss about China and U.S. relations. Last year, Joe Biden dismissed China as a competitor and believes concerns that China could eventually surpass the U.S. as a world superpower and overstate it. Do you think they put China for competitor or enemy?
Well, I think the Biden administration sees China in all of its complexity. And I think it recognizes that there are different elements to the U.S.-China relationship. There's definitely an element of competition around a number of different issues, from trade and economic development and technology in particular, along with a host of other areas. But at the same time, the Biden administration recognizes that there are also some areas where it makes a lot of sense for the United States and for China to cooperate and to work together toward a common objective, whether that's with respect to nuclear nonproliferation or public health, COVID-19, and a host of other issues, climate change, of course. And I think this administration understands that no one word or no one adjective can fully describe the complexity of the relationship and the nature of the relationship. And I think that nuance is welcome. I think that nuance is appropriate. And I think the administration is coming at China from a realistic and thoughtful angle, and basically saying, look, there are areas where we have disagreements and strongly opposing viewpoints, but there are also areas where we need to work together because it's in our interest to do that. I think that approach makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Can you talk about new Biden administration with China's relationship compared to Trump administration?
Well, I think there are some important differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration in the fundamental framing of China and the way that the two administrations talk about China. With the Trump administration, it was a very adversarial tonality, particularly over the last year, but even predating that, dating back to 2018 and the trade war. Whereas the Biden administration, in contrast, I think calibrates its language and its tonality very differently, rather than framing China as the enemy of the United States, as some serious and senior voices in the Trump administration tended to do. This administration, I think, frames China as a formidable competitor to the United States, but also a potential partner in a variety of different areas. And so I think the language reflects a change in the thinking. And I think the thinking, again, is more nuanced, less ideological, more pragmatic, and more focused on bottom line results and bottom line interests for the United States and for the relationship. And so I think the main area of difference right now between the Trump administration and now the Biden administration is in this tonality, and it's in the language and the rhetoric and how the president and other senior officials in the United States communicate about China. But that being said, I think at this particular moment in time, the substance of U.S. policy toward China, for the most part, is very recognizable relative to what we saw during the 4 years of the Trump administration. But over time, I think we will start to see some shifts, particularly, I think, in terms of the largest possibility of real change in the trade area. And I think we're going to see a somewhat different approach to trade over the next year or two. That being said, most of the change that we've seen so far is tonal, but I think that's important, and I think we're moving back in a more constructive direction in that regard.
Thank you. Could you explain to me what happened? How are H&M and Nike discriminating against Xinjiang?
Well, you have a lot of concern in the United States about the situation in Xinjiang and about the human rights picture in Xinjiang. And it's not just in the United States, but around much of the world. There's a lot of concern about some of the things that have been reported to be taking place there. And a lot of U.S. and Western companies, such as the ones that you mentioned, have come under some pressure from their boards and from their stakeholders and their consumers to not be involved in any activities that would in any way be conducive to the perpetration of what many in the United States and elsewhere regard as human rights abuses that are occurring in Xinjiang. Companies want to be sensitive to their stakeholders. They want to be sensitive to their customers. They want to be sensitive to how their brand image as a corporate entity comes across to the public. And so I think you now have instances in which U.S. and other Western companies, such as Nike, H&M, and others, are starting to make efforts to dissociate themselves from any production processes or inputs coming from Xinjiang that could potentially create either the reality or the perception that these companies are involved in a way that is contrary to their values as companies. And as a result, they've made decisions to stop sourcing things from Xinjiang in some cases. And as a result of that, many in China, I think, reportedly are upset at these countries and in turn boycotting them. So, it's not an unusual situation when you're dealing with highly sensitive issues where emotions run high. And I think it's incumbent upon these companies to do what they think is in their best interest. And it's certainly well within the rights of Chinese consumers to express their values as they see fit as well.
All right, interesting. Is COVID-19 infecting the relationship between the U.S. and China?
I think COVID-19 had a very, very serious impact on the U.S.-China relationship, starting when COVID-19 really hit the shores of the United States in February or so of last year, about 15 months ago. And there's no question that the COVID-19 story has had a devastating effect on U.S. public sentiment toward China. Basically, it cut in half the level of public favorability toward China among the American public. I think, meanwhile, by virtue of some of the same dynamics and some of the things that have happened in the United States, some of the very painful rhetoric that some U.S. politicians have resorted to in terms of talking about, quote, the China virus and so on, that has had a similar impact on Chinese public sentiment toward the United States. And as a result, COVID-19 has been a major trust drainer and favorable sentiment drainer in the relationship on both sides. It certainly happened here. It took ratings that were historically in the sort of low to mid 40s in terms of favorable views of China down to about 20%. So it literally cut in half favorable sentiment in this country toward China just in a very short span of really a few months, mainly in the spring of 2020, about a year ago. So I think there's no question that COVID-19 has had a very profound and negative impact on the relationship, and it's worked in both directions. And I know that sentiment in China today toward the United States has also taken a serious hit. And we've got a lot of work to do, those of us that care about public sentiment between the two countries and about the relationship generally, to try to get this relationship moving back in a more positive direction, because things are very difficult right now, and I think they will be for some time to come. There's a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Can you talk about Hong Kong and Taiwan relations with China and the U.S.?
Well, these are two issues that have really become quite contentious in the relationship. Just starting with Hong Kong, obviously, there have been a lot of concerns expressed in the United States and certainly in Hong Kong as well, and around the world about some of the recent developments that we've seen over the last 11 months or so in Hong Kong, since the national security law of Hong Kong was put on the books in June of 2020. It is a situation that I think causes alarm in the United States and in the U.S. business community. There's a concern that Hong Kong is not the kind of place that it was a year ago in terms of the ability of individuals and companies to operate and feel confident that they're not going to be punished for saying certain things or doing certain things. And so I think the issue of Hong Kong has become a very central problem in the relationship. Obviously, the U.S. and Chinese perspectives on what's happening in Hong Kong are very different. China certainly sees it very, very differently than the United States. But from an American standpoint, it certainly is a concerning situation. And there are aspects of the national security law that create some very serious concerns and potential vulnerabilities on the part of U.S. companies and U.S. Individuals that may be operating in Hong Kong. And I think this issue is going to be a source of contention for quite some time to come. With respect to Taiwan, we've seen with the Biden administration a continuation of, I would say, a more robust approach to Taiwan from an American perspective, still within the constraints of the longstanding One China policy, which I strongly support. But nevertheless, I would say a pushing of the envelope in the direction of trying to engage more with Taiwan, again, from an American perspective, trying to make it clear that the United States values its relationship with Taiwan. Meanwhile, the United States has expressed some serious concerns about certain Chinese actions with respect to what Taiwan would regard as its air defense identification zone and incursions therein from the Chinese military. And certainly from China's perspective, China's tremendously concerned at what it sees as provocative steps that the United States is taking to enhance its relationship with Taiwan. One thing that has come into the news just in the last few days is that the United States has called for Taiwan to become an observer in the World Health Assembly, or WHA, something that I think makes a lot of sense. I think it's a sound idea. I think the reasoning is compelling. The idea is you've got to have everyone at the table when you're talking about a global pandemic. And I think the United States position on this is the right position. But I absolutely understand that from a Chinese perspective, it's a very problematic position. And now this, too, in terms of Taiwan, is an area of some contention in the relationship. And obviously, it touches on tremendous sensitivities in China. So I think things are going to continue to be very tense around the issue of Taiwan and cross-strait relations. But that said, historically, the United States and China have been able to manage those tensions, and I expect that we'll be able to continue to do that as we go forward.
Thank you. What's your hope for the future?
Well, in terms of the future of the U.S.-China relationship, I hope we can get to a better place than we are now. I think the relationship between the United States and China today is very suboptimal. From speaking as an American, it's suboptimal from an American standpoint. I think it's not serving our interests to have a relationship with China that is dysfunctional. And in fact, as viewed from an American perspective, I think a lot of things in the U.S.-China relationship are worse today than they were 4 years ago. And we've got to get this relationship moving back in a new direction. For one thing, I could cite many examples, but just in terms of the U.S.-China trade relationship, both the United States and China are being hurt by the current tariff policies that each country has in place. And we actually have calculated that the Trump administration has run the largest average annual merchandise deficit with China in America's history, after having pledged that it would cut the deficit. But it did exactly the opposite. It increased the deficit. 17% higher than Barack Obama's average annual deficit with China, and nearly 100% higher than George W. Bush's average annual merchandise deficit with China. We're moving in the wrong direction. But China is as well. We've got these job-killing tariffs that are hurting each of our own countries. Let's get rid of them. I hope we'll see more confidence-building measures in terms of the consulates, the cultural exchange programs, the Fulbright program, the Peace Corps, getting journalists back into each other's countries, getting student visas back up to the numbers that we should see between two countries of this level of importance. There are a lot of things that we can do that are not hard to do. They just require the expenditure of a little bit of political capital. I hope we see that going forward. But I really want to see a relationship that is more functional, that is more constructive, and ultimately that is more results-oriented, mutually beneficial, and politically sustainable.
Thank you. Let's back to your personal life. As we know, you are speaks near native level Chinese. You are an expert in China, a career U.S. diplomat from 1992 to 2010. In your foreign service career, you served at the U.S. embassies in Beijing for 5 years. Can you talk about your China experience in the Mandarin? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for asking that. 其实我第一次到中国是1984年，那一次我参加了一个比较大的旅游团，跟我的父母一起去的。那是我第一次到中国，给我留下很深的印象。之前呢，我对中国、对亚洲，对这个全世界了解不是很深，但是那一次去了以后，我感觉到这个国家，是非常值得学习，这个历史、这个价值观、它的经济、它的政治，是非常有意思的一个话题。之后呢，我就决定学国际关系，然后在这个领域里面把重点放在亚洲和中国。然后我到乔治城大学读就是本科的时候，我学了国际关系和中国事务。我越学我越感觉到这是一个非常有意思的一个事情，一个领域。后来我有机会在大陆留学半年，之后呢，在大陆还待了差不多用了半年的时间做一些实习生的工作。之后呢，我成为美国外交官，而且有幸是有机会到中国大陆到美国驻华大使馆。工作，那是我第一次以美国外交官的身份到国外，加起来呢，我在中国待的时间差不多有6年左右，然后我在中国的朋友非常多，所以中国对我来讲，除了我这个职业以外，对我个人的生活来讲，还是一个非常重要的一个因素。
那对于您来说，中国最吸引您的地方在哪里？
有很多，它的文化，这个中国的历史，中国的现代流行文化，也是对我也是很有吸引力的。中国菜也是很有吸引力的，中国人的热情，这个好几个方面我都觉得是真的是，我感觉到我在中国的时候，我住在中国的时候，感觉到很舒服，就是不会觉得。我是所谓的外国人，我会觉得我是在我的朋友，甚至于有一点像家人的那种气氛下，我觉得这些对我个人的这个吸引力都是挺大的。
好，谢谢大为先生今天接受我的采访。您刚才讲的您在中国的这个经历，我相信在您的一生中都是非常难忘的这几年，对吧？
对，的确是这样的，而且。有一段时间我没有去中国，我希望这个疫情就是转变了以后，我能够有机会回到中国，再见一下我的好久没见的一些朋友。
OK. Thanks for your time, David.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
See you next time.
Thank you.
这就是今天的子天访谈录，我是子天 Skydo，我们下期再见。